Hi. Thank you for coming this morning to this, the third of four panels that I'm leading this week at the International Journalism Festival. My name is Justin Peters. I am from the Columbia Journalism Review in New York City. And the general theme that we're discussing this week in these panels is how to do good journalism when all the odds are against you. It's a question that I think is on many journalists' minds in these difficult times. And I don't know if we've come up with any answers so far, but we've had a lot of good discussions, and that's what I'm hoping for again today. The topic of today's talk is getting smart about social media. And if that topic sounds familiar to you, and if you feel like you've attended this panel before, you're not wrong. It seems like every day at the conference, both this year and last, there's about 7 different panels on social media, how to use it, why to use it, how to do it well. And I think the reason we're still having these panels about 8 or 9 years after Facebook and Twitter and whatnot popped onto the scene and made our lives exponentially more complicated and difficult or whatnot, is because we are still unsure what they mean, how to use them, how best to use them. That's why we are having these panels, to sort of try to figure that out altogether. And we know what we're supposed to do with them. Of course, we're at no loss for tips about how to maximize one's Twitter presence or how to build a robust Facebook fan page and all of that. And, that's very important, to understand. Those are, super relevant tips and instructions for anyone who is working in a modern media environment. But I also think that too often we leave the discussion there, and that's sort of why there's still so much confusion in my mind. Because when we leave the discussion about social media as a discussion about certain prominent platforms, then we're really not talking about the base elements of what social media actually is. And it's not just a list of tips and strategies about how to increase your presence or better promote your brand. What social media means in sort of the most basic sense is just sharing ideas and stories about which you are excited, right? Forging these sort of connections with one another, these very small things that all in one by one might not seem like much, but in the aggregate mean a great deal. That's not the property of Facebook or Twitter. That belongs to all of us. That's what we've done as long as humanity has existed. So once we realize that, and get beyond the idea of social media as just another salesmanship tool, but instead understand it as just a new terminology for something that journalism has always intended to do, then we can come up with ways to deploy it more effectively and more strategically. Journalists and newsrooms can think about ways to better promote the sorts of interactions between their readers and their staffers. They can I'm sorry, I'm very, very tired. They can come up with ways to deploy sociability as a tool to improve the work that they're doing. To take advantage, to harness the power of these new networks, to devise entirely new ways to inform people and forge the sorts of connections that news has always, its base, been meant to forge. So, sure, let's talk about Facebook and Twitter. I mean, they're very important, platforms, and we will talk about them today. It's important to know about them and to know how to use them, But when you do get smart about social media as a concept, then Facebook and Twitter are only the beginning. And, you know, to help me today, I've got 4 people who I think are very smart about social media, and I'm really thrilled to have them on this panel. From my immediate left, we have Mark Johnson, who is the community editor at The Economist. We have Massimo Mantellini, who is a journalist and blogger who writes on technology and the internet for places like Punto Informatico, L'Espresso, and Il Post. To his left, we have Eric Carvin, who is the social media editor for the Associated Press. And to Eric's left, we have Sue Llewellyn, who is a former BBC journalist and current digital strategy consultant. And I'm going to start with Mark. Mark, you've written or said that The Economist aspires to become more like a conference as opposed to just a publication. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that means and also what that means in terms of the stuff I was just saying in that tortured, overly long, pause-ridden introduction I just gave.
No problem, thank you. I fear you may already have said most of my points, but no, right, don't worry. We'll go. So yes, journalism as a conference. Where shall we start? I think let's go back right to the beginning of what The Economist is all about, to give you my perspective on it. We were founded in 1843, and we have this mission statement which still stays very relevant to us today, and we print it on the inside cover, on the contents pages of the magazine. And it reads that The Economist was founded to provoke a severe discussion between ignorance and intelligence, a severe contest between ignorance and intelligence. And although I don't think our founder, James Wilson, when he wrote those words 160 years ago, quite anticipated that we'd be translating it in the way that we do today, it's fairly obvious to me that if the magazine wants to continue to provoke this severe contest between readers, between ignorance and intelligence, it no longer needs to do that just on the pages of its magazine, or indeed in some of the conferences that we promote, but also in the message boards, the forums, the community sites all around the web. It's in those discussions that we need to be taking part, and it's those discussions that we need to be convening. So that mission statement gives us a good reason to be on all of these platforms, and it gives us a good reason also to build out the community on economist.com. Newspapers' own sites are the social media sites right underneath our noses, and as Justin's already said, I think it's very important that we don't forget those sites. I think we need to treat the social networks a bit as frenemies, friendly enemies. I think the only social media site that you can really count on is your own, and while it's important that we spread all across the web, I think it's important that we hang on to our own sites as well and continue to invest and develop in those. And just to talk about this idea of journalism as a conference, it occurs to me that social media doesn't replace journalists, it doesn't really even threaten journalists, but it offers journalists with an opportunity to do something that's brand new, to add to what they've always done, a whole nother area of value for the people who read it. Where even though newspapers are heading downward at a terrifying rate, the conference business seems to be booming, as you all know from being here today. You can go to a conference every single day of the week in journalism, it seems, if your stamina and your budget allow. And at these conferences, the panels are fine, and I hope we don't bore you, but they're not necessarily the main reason why you're here, nor really are you here for the Q&As that follow after, although those are often more interesting than the talks themselves. A main reason that you're here, I've no doubt, is the networking, the connections that you make, the lunches, the dinners, and the drinks back at the hotel. That is a whole additional reason of value, and one of the reasons why the conference trade is doing so well. And I think more newspaper sites should be like that. They should be a place not only to read what journalists have to say, but to make connections with other people who can help them in their life, in their business world, connect them with people that they wouldn't have met otherwise. One problem with many social networks, especially Facebook, is that it's all about connecting with people you already know. And I think newspapers, and especially newspapers like The Economist, which really have an international perspective and an international readership, have a lot to offer in terms of presenting you the perspectives of people you would never have come across before, connecting you with people who might be able to help you in your personal life or help you in your career. And that's why we're so excited about community and social media at The Economist, and why it's an area that we're continuing to invest in.
Massimo, I was hoping you could sort of jump on this idea that Mark was just discussing about this sort of a news organization site as sort of a conference, a sort of conduit for interactions between reporters and readers and so on and so forth. It often seems when I come to this conference that about 80% of all of the people in Italy who are talking about social media, and using it are here, right now. And it's not quite clear how far beyond Perugia it extends. Could you, just give us a straightforward, overview of, in your opinion, how the Italian media is addressing the points that Mark was just talking about and how they could improve?
Ok, no, è molto interessante questo accenno, perché mi consente di dire una cosa che secondo me è una peculiarità dell'approccio ai social media che c'è in Italia, dove molto spesso la bolla prevale sull'interesse di allargare il proprio bacino di utenza, e quindi per ragioni che sono in parte anche dovute a peculiarità del nostro paese, però c'è una sottolineatura molto forte degli aspetti di rete sociale che riguardano la singola persona, il singolo giornalista, i rapporti fra il giornalista e gli altri giornalisti, molto prima di una sorta di interesse aziendale più ampio che può essere ovviamente categorizzato all'interno di una strategia editoriale. E quindi cosa succede? Per esempio Twitter è un esempio molto, secondo me, significativo di questa specie di bolla di interessi. Se voi seguite un po' di giornalisti su Twitter, vi accorgerete che i giornalisti seguono altri giornalisti, e la gran parte della conversazione che avviene è una conversazione fra persone che tutto sommato hanno lo stesso linguaggio, gli stessi interessi, hanno lo stesso approccio alle informazioni. Questo può essere interessante per un lettore che non fa parte, diciamo, di questa compagnia a giro, ma nello stesso tempo ha un grosso limite da un punto di vista editoriale, nel senso che diciamo, prevale l'aspetto personale rispetto a quello di a una funzione direttamente editoriale. Sta cambiando qualcosa, nel senso che in alcuni grandi quotidiani, per esempio, da qualche tempo ci sono figure dedicate a un'attività di coordinamento editoriale sia su Facebook che su Twitter, che riguardano quindi la linea del giornale, gli articoli, i collegamenti con altre persone. Però per ora in Italia prevale questa sorta di declinazione individuale, che è poi quella che c'è sempre un po' stata in rete, nel senso che noi abbiamo sempre detto che lo sviluppo della rete italiana è sempre stato uno sviluppo ombelicale. Per molti anni abbiamo avuto i blog come uno strumento di relazione ed erano letti forse da molte persone, ma comunque frequentati ed utilizzati da poche. E però succede sempre la stessa cosa, vale a dire c'è una specie di effetto di amplificazione che poi arriva sui grandi media. Allora, quando c'è una polemica su Twitter che magari riguarda due giornalisti che litigano su una questione che è molto loro privata, questa poi ha la capacità virale di andare a finire anche il giorno dopo sul quotidiano, che viene letto da 500.000 persone. Quindi tutto sommato questo innesca un meccanismo che ha alcuni aspetti, insomma, in qualche maniera tossici, nel senso che È un ambiente dove viene fatta prevalere la tendenza a parlare di se stesso. Questa è una cosa che in qualche maniera deve essere interrotta. Detto questo tipo di approccio abbastanza personale è tipicamente una cosa che noi troviamo anche sui quotidiani, per cui da molti anni in Italia c'è una declinazione delle opinioni e dei punti di vista che è molto riferita all'editoriale, al punto di vista del singolo opinionista che diventa una persona importante, che frequenta i talk show in televisione, e questo è come se declinasse in maniera molto forte la notizia. Possiamo dire che sui media digitali sta succedendo in qualche maniera per adesso la stessa cosa.
Eric Carvin, let's jump on this idea of journalists talking to other journalists. As I'm sure that's something that you've certainly seen, as anyone who is a working journalist in the United States, can see if they spend their day on Twitter, half of their day is spent talking with, exchanging sort of limp jokes and links with people they work with or they know through the business. What have you done sort of at the Associated Press in your job and sort of helping to design and implement the strategy for both the organization as a whole and for the thousands of journalists who work there to try to get people beyond just this sort of insular conversation and try to reach out and actually interact with the wider world and work that into the work they do?
Well, first of all, before I go into that, I just want to say I'm really curious about how the word frenemy was translated into Italian. So if there's somebody who's bilingual who could tweet that, please, I'd like to see that later. As far as individual journalists and the conversation that happens online, so I think the most important lesson that comes out of that, and that I like to teach our journalists, is just making the important, very careful decisions about what you do and don't say. Is to remember the fact that you're in a public forum here. So there's a wonderful opportunity there to be able to make connections with fellow journalists, and the Associated Press in particular. I mean, we're a news agency that a number, maybe even a majority of news organizations in the world are connected to us in some way. We have partners and customers and members, and so a lot of times journalists at other news organizations are actually we actually have a relationship with them. But even with competition, in order to really make sure that you have your finger on the pulse of your beat. And this is especially important for a beat reporter. You cover a particular very focused location or a topic. The better you can establish your presence in the community surrounding that topic or that location, the better a journalist you're going to be. And this means this means making connections with fellow journalists, but also with members of the public who have an interest in those topics, with government officials, and being aware of what they are and aren't saying. And people at organizations of various kinds as well. And the more of a presence that you establish for yourself, first of all, the more likely you are to have the news tips come to you instead of to the other guy. Because, I mean, let's be honest, there's competition involved here, and we're all trying to, everyone's trying to beat somebody out there in the world. So you want to be the one that people are going to come to. But then just as important is that you're keeping an eye on what everybody else is saying, because, to be honest, I talk to our journalists a lot about, what do you think about what you're working on, think about the exclusive stories that are coming up, and then think very carefully about how little you want to say about them. Usually nothing. And if you are a very smart journalist, you keep all of your exclusive stuff to yourself. That's not necessarily for social networks, because you don't have to go there with everything. But at the same time, you're watching everyone else. Some of them may be a little more open than you are. And again, I don't mean to be too focused on competition, but that's really kind of what happens on the journalist to journalist level. And it's very friendly in a lot of ways, and very sort of even jocular at times, as we were saying here too. But it's really an important topic. I have a few other getting smart about social media ideas, but I don't know if you want to kind of roll back to them after we have our initial little talks here.
Let's go back to those. I'm really interested in hearing about it, though. But Sue, Sort of, I think you and Eric do sort of similar jobs in a lot of ways. Eric trains a lot of people at the AP, while you go out and train people at dispersed news organizations around the world. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, sort of bring it back to the themes I was articulating in my introduction about the idea of social media as, just another name for, sharing content that you get really sort of excited about and forging these sorts of human connections, sort of the psychology of social engagement. How does that come into sort of the training that you do with a lot of people, and how do people respond to the notion of social media when you sort of phrase it that way?
I would say that there's two aspects to this. One is the image that you're having as you're pulling stuff in, and one is as you're pushing it out. So first up, the pulling it in. It's you've got to be curious about things, and I approach all the people I'm training by saying, what's in it for you? And that's the sort of key behavioral driver. If you can find what it is that the journalist wants to get out of it, then they're suddenly going to be interested. So for some of the high-level people on TV, it's ego. They want a bigger audience. They want sort of people reading their blogs or whatever it is, that kind of thing. For the working journalist, it could be saving them time, finding a really good case study, or a really good story idea. So this is the way I do it, because each one of us has different motivators. And that's really important. So there's finding what I call the Wi-Fi point, W-I-F-F-Y, what's in it for you. Once you've found that, then suddenly people get interested. So there's that kind of, the psychology of that side of it. On the other side, I would also say really successful social media engages the emotions. If you haven't got that kind of emotional engagement, then it's not going to resonate with people. We are naturally social creatures, and whilst technology has changed, people haven't. We still have the same basic needs. That might be to share something with somebody because it makes you feel good, so you're altruistic. It might be that you want to feel important, so you're sharing something that way. The key things that work really well are sort of empathy or nostalgia. If you can tap into those with the stuff that you're sharing online, it's going to make a massive difference. We're also incredibly visual creatures. And I think that if you can put the photos in there that could tell a story, that makes a massive difference as well. So trying to work out what it is that people find interesting. And one of the questions I get asked after what's a hashtag, the most common question is, how do I get more followers? Well, you get more followers by being interesting, sharing interesting stuff, being honest, being truthful, and being human. So I think that those are the sort of things. It's the really, really simple stuff that anybody can get to grips with.
I'm going to stay with you here for a second. Journalists, I think, are inherently sort of interesting people. They spend their lives, going, well, the good ones, going out in the world, finding out things about the world, and then telling the rest of the world about those things. Why do so many journalists who have interesting jobs and are interesting people have such trouble being actually interesting on social media? You have any thoughts on that?
I think many of them still think that well, certainly I come from a broadcasting background, and so quite a lot of people are simply broadcasting, and that's not good enough. It doesn't engage the audience, because it's, look, I'm here, you're there, let me tell you about it. Used to be the old-fashioned way of doing journalism. It's now, you're there, I'm here, you tell me about it, and we can collaborate on things. So I think part of it is that sense of, I'm a journalist and I'm really important, and I know more than you do, but actually the audience knows more than we do. And that's the key to making better stories, is collaborating with them.
Mark Johnson, perhaps I'm being too broad here, please take no offense, but I think sort of The Economist as a publication sort of has a reputation of, hello, we know more than you do about, essentially most of what's going on in the world. How have you and sort of the rest of the people there, come up with ways to sort of take that expertise and actually translate it into something that is not just broadcasting that expertise over whatever social media avenues you're using, but actually turning it into something that is sort of engaging with readers and something in which they can participate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's it's certainly true that in many ways The Economist doesn't seem like a good fit for social media. I mean, we write these long pieces of analysis when social media seems to want short, whippy sound bites and quotable pieces. You know, we have this common style that we're very proud of. Somebody once uncharitably described it to me as like the voice of God. I'm not sure if that's entirely fair, but that's the perception. And we also have this issue that, unlike most newspapers, we write without bylines. So our names do not appear in the magazine. We're not anonymous. It's not MI6. We're allowed to say, I wrote that piece, but we don't have our names on the pieces, and we don't really promote individual journalists. So all that adds up to an interesting challenge for people who do social media at a magazine like The Economist. And there are two reasons why actually The Economist is a better fit than you might think. One is that because it's so distinctive, because it's so different to much of what else is out there, there's already a sense, and has been for 100 years, that people who are readers of The Economist are already part of a community. They're just part of an offline community, a sort of imagined community to some extent. And social media is helping us to make that real. So that's one advantage for us. And the other thing is that people who are part of this reader community are very, very proud of it. Again, probably because of its distinctiveness. There's this quote that I like from, I think it's Ezra Klein in the Washington Post, who said that carrying a copy of The Economist is like wearing a shirt that says, I'm smart, unworldly, and interested in knowing things about Ghana. And that might be a backhanded compliment, but I think that's one of the reasons why social media has worked for us, because people who feel part of this strong community already also feel like they want to share it. They want to post on their social networks that they read it, and they want to share stories with other people. They have a strong incentive to do so. It's a badge brand, I've heard it described as, and that's a good thing for us. So, to some extent, I don't think that news organisations should necessarily worry so much about being social media type newspapers. I think there's a risk that we listen to all this advice from social media gurus that says you must do X, Y, and Z to succeed on social networks. And then we end up sort of twisting what's good about our publications to fit that medium. And instead, I think newspapers need to find out what it is that people love about them, what it is that makes you different, and then work out how to convert that onto social networks rather than do it the other way round. So a lot of what we're doing on our main brand accounts on Twitter and Facebook is, to some extent, publishing links to stories that we've written. A lot because that's what we found that people want from us. They actually, they want a convenient way to receive links to things that we've written about. And indeed, when we've tried with that main brand account to do things that are very different and very imaginative, we get complaints. We've got 3 million Twitter followers now, and they will tell us very quickly if we think we're filling their feeds with things that they don't want to hear. So in some ways, the size of that account is a bit of an obstacle to doing things that are really inventive with it. So what we do instead is we have a series of sub-brands. We have 20 accounts in the names of areas of our paper: Econ Britain for Britain, Econ Europe for Europe News, and those are each run by a journalist. And those are the accounts where we say to people, just experiment, do whatever you like, let's share best practices. If you want to link out to other news organisations, do it. We have Econ Daily Charts, is a really good, this is our, from our data and our charts team, are really good at pointing people to things around the web that are interesting. We have Econ Charlemagne. Our Charlemagne correspondent, our columnist, is our European writer based in Brussels, and he uses it very much as a personal account. It's there where you'll get live blogging from those smoky late-night EU sessions. So that's how we've managed to be both true to what The Economist is with our sort of main accounts, and also proliferate into lots of smaller accounts that do more interesting things. And increasingly, we're doing more editorial events on these channels. So we've set up, on Twitter, we have something called Econ Discuss. That's the account that we use for Q&As. So we do a monthly Q&A with normally a journalist. And we're also using Google Hangouts now. We're really enjoying Hangouts, I have to say. We're getting 8 or 9 readers on a call, often to have a discussion with an Economist journalist, but also other people. We had a hangout with our cartoonist last week, who's been cartooning for the paper for 30 years, and that went down really well. So I think the main thing I would say is that what's going to help you succeed on social media is having something very distinctive to promote. If you think the newsstand is competitive, then social media is a whole other world. You've got every newspaper on earth battling for attention, along with every journalist who works for them, and ordinary people as well. And unless what you do is very different to what everybody else does, then it's going to be hard to break through, however chatty you are. And people don't like it when I say that, because a lot of people think that you can fix what's wrong with your newspaper through social. In fact, succeeding on social is about what you are in the first place, and that's a harder problem for people to fix.
I just want to say that if you actually made that T-shirt about "I'm smarter than you and I want to know about Ghana," I would buy it. So, just something to bring back to the home office. A little tip. Massimo, I want to go back to something, and of course, feel free to jump in if you got other sort of things to say as well. I want to go back to something that Mark was saying a little bit earlier about the importance of, trying to hold on to your own site, to not rely too much on sort of these frenemies like. There we go again, the translation, like Facebook or Twitter, but to try to devise one's own sort of presence. You wrote something a little bit earlier this month about Facebook Home, that was just introduced, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you wrote something about, I think you said, every little piece of software that the giants of the communication network add to our lives is now a small contribution to the reduction of our freedom. Could you talk a little bit about that concept as both in general and how it might sort of more specifically relate to how you think sort of Italian media organizations and media organizations in general are and ought to be thinking about social media?
Sì, grazie. Prima dico una cosa a Mark, ho sentito i giorni scorsi, non so in quale panel, qualcuno che diceva no, io non voglio che l'Economist diventi sociale, voglio che sia autorevole, autoritario, che mi dica come funziona il mondo, e questo è quello che diceva lui poco fa, ed è una cosa interessante, nel senso che l'essenza delle relazioni sociali in rete non è necessariamente quella di un rapporto che debba avere lo stesso valore in entrambe le direzioni, ma ci sono tutta una serie di valori esistenti che vengono rappresentati sui media digitali, e quindi nel momento in cui noi riconosciamo a qualcuno un'autorevolezza di qualche tipo, questa può essere fatta in mille maniere, ma certamente lo strumento che utilizziamo non deve servire per cambiare un set di valori che noi abbiamo messo assieme. L'altra cosa che volevo dire rispetto a quello che diceva Siu prima, quello sulle creature sociali, è vero, quello che succede normalmente in Italia, ma credo un po' ovunque, è che per esempio Twitter è uno strumento formidabile per capire meglio come sono fatte umanamente alcune persone che noi leggiamo sui giornali. La mia esperienza personale nei confronti di alcuni giornalisti che per esempio io leggo quotidianamente sui quotidiani o sui settimanali è stata molto arricchita dalla loro presenza su Twitter, perché in generale questo tipo di esposizione digitale aggiunge una serie di idee che noi ci facciamo su queste persone che magari non avremmo immaginato. Io ho trovato persone che trovavo estremamente condivisibili nelle cose che scrivevano sui loro articoli ogni giorno, le ho trovate umanamente non così interessanti nel momento in cui si esprimevano con molta apertura e libertà, per esempio su Twitter, e viceversa. Magari alcuni editorialisti che hanno punti di vista lontanissimi dal mio avevano effettivamente tutta una serie di consonanze con questioni che mi riguardano e quindi insomma c'è una sorpresa che è legata al fatto che il nostro essere creature sociali racconta meglio noi stessi, e quindi questo secondo me contribuisce a dare un'idea migliore del giornalismo. Ti ringrazio molto per la citazione del mio articolo su Facebook Home. Secondo me c'è un tema che riguarda la tecnologia e i rapporti con le informazioni, nel senso che ovviamente ci sono finalità differenti fra chi fornisce le piattaforme, chi ne fruisce tutte le opzioni e le possibilità, e diciamo un interesse generale che riguarda l'informazione. Io non sono sicurissimo che in una logica molto ampia strumenti che polarizzano molto i contenuti editoriali all'interno di alcune piattaforme chiuse siano una buona idea. Io credo che noi dovremmo comunque mantenere all'interno ovviamente delle nostre prerogative di scegliere quali sono gli strumenti che utilizziamo l'interesse dell'informazione, ma soprattutto quello dei cittadini è quello di essere all'interno di un ambiente informativo che è il più vasto e ampio possibile. Su Facebook, per esempio, io non ho mai utilizzato la funzione per cui all'interno di Facebook devo andare a leggere un articolo che è su un quotidiano sul web, ma che viene segnalato da un mio amico di Facebook e devo andarlo a leggere in un'applicazione dentro Facebook. Io trovo che questo sia una specie di rete che mi avvolge e della quale non abbiamo grande bisogno. Allora io capisco gli interessi di tutti, ma l'interesse generale dei lettori e quelli di chi invece producono l'informazione, secondo me in questo tipo di approccio alla tecnologia coincide, nel senso che io lettore e io giornalista ho la necessità e l'interesse a utilizzare tutte le piattaforme possibili per ovviamente collegarmi al maggior numero di persone possibile, ma senza subire la dittatura di alcune piattaforme che tendono a mantenerti all'interno del loro ambiente.
I actually, I'll go you one better on that. When I use Facebook, I have a specific browser that I only use for Facebook because I don't want to be tracked across my usage. I will copy and paste links from Facebook into a different browser just to open it there. Yeah, fight the power. Oh, God. All right, Eric Carvin, someone, I forget who said this, either Mark or Massimo, I think it's very interesting, though, the idea that one's social media sort of strategy or what one does with social media shouldn't necessarily change the values of the news organization. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of the Associated Press and your work there? And of course, feel free to jump in on anything anyone else has said.
It's actually a pretty good segue for some of the stuff I wanted to talk about, because I think there's even a broader way to state that, which is that the use of social media shouldn't be changing our overall values as journalists, as the community of journalists, wherever you might work. So it works. So it's very important on the local level. And I think that certainly for us at AP, we have the same sense that you do at the Economist. We're not going to change who we are as a news organization for social. We're going to use social to further the goals of what we want to do as a news organization. And I would say you mentioned before, Mark, made a few remarks about succeeding in social, and it's important to try to do that as a journalist now. But the number one goal is to use social to succeed as a journalist. And what one of the things I like to tell our folks is, look, and this is something you touched on a little bit, Sue, about figuring out what you need social for. What is the point of it for you as a journalist? So what I tell people, especially those who are newer to this or who are skeptical in some way, I say, look, what is it you're trying? People come to me all the time and say, well, I don't feel like tweeting links all day. And so I'll tell them, look, don't tweet links all day. The number one thing you can do with social as a journalist, and this is our number one priority at AP with social, is to break news stories, to find news, to find sources, to find witnesses, to find the person who's going to get you your next story. If you never tweet a single time in your life, but you use Twitter to break stories on a regular basis, then you are an incredibly successful user of social media as a journalist. And that's the way I see it. Yes, it's good to be able to also be in the community, and as I was talking about before, to build your presence online. But again, to me, the most important reason to do that is because hopefully that yields more opportunities for stories. It potentially can direct direct sources your way. So I wanted to talk a little bit sort of off of that in terms of the journalistic values that we hold dear and the importance in maintaining those within a social world. I would say that the top two things that come to mind for me in terms of getting smarter with social, as journalists specifically. So one of them, Sue mentioned also the sort of the in and the out of social media, and that's something I like to think of it that way too, sort of input and output. And again, for me, the input is a higher priority because that's where you get your news stories. So on the input side, one thing we've been talking a lot at AP recently about is the safety and security of the people we are gathering information from on social media. Now, this is something we've thought about our own journalists, as long as they've been around, and certainly freelancers as well. Now we find ourselves connecting with members of the public who are witnessing something. Maybe they have photos or video of whatever it is that they're witnessing, and they and we're interested in talking to them, getting that information from them, in some cases getting permission to use their content. I think there have been some missteps over the last few years in terms of how that's approached by some of these organizations. And so we decided to actually sit down and put together a set of guidelines of how to approach people using social media for news gathering in dangerous and sensitive situations. Forgive me if you went to another talk I was on. I talked about some of this, but just very briefly, that the bottom line is first of all deciding when it's even appropriate to do so. One of the stupidest things you can do with social media is get somebody hurt or get somebody in trouble, and that's something that we desperately want to avoid. And again, that happens internally for us as well. We need to make sure that our own journalists who are overseas in dangerous places are being careful about how they use social, because we don't want them to get themselves in trouble or in any way interfere with their ability to do their jobs as reporters, or their colleagues for that matter. So we take that concept and we apply that to members of the public who we work with through social. And in some cases, it means if somebody is in a truly dangerous situation, we maybe wait. Sometimes we realize the safest thing for them to do, and the ethical approach, is to wait until they're in a safe place before we start asking them questions about where they were. That may vary a little bit if somebody is openly sharing information and is essentially kind of asking to get content out. We might reach out to them. But we always urge people to stay safe. We never ask anybody to gather content in a dangerous situation. If they've already done so, we might be open to working with it. We always specifically say, be safe, don't get yourself in a dangerous situation, and be very careful. And that's something that's sort of kind of been written down at AP now, and it's something we take very seriously. And on the other side of it, on kind of the output piece of social, the most important thing we can do with it, I think we really need to reestablish a commitment to accuracy and standards on what we share on social as news organizations. I think there's an unfortunate reality that a lot of news orgs they view social media as a little bit of a softer platform than the places where they usually publish their content. And therefore, they may have different standards. For example, they may tweet something that they haven't quite fully confirmed, but that they suspect is the case. They may retweet somebody who has a report on something without really knowing for sure if there's solid confirmation or knowing what the source is of that information. So we have a rule at AP. If you're going to tweet it, it better be information that we would be comfortable putting on the wire and sending to every one of our customers around the world. So that's, and I think that there is actually a movement in that direction now. I think that what happened with the Boston bombings has renewed the conversation about that, especially. There were some inaccuracies that went around whether or not you were using social media, so it wasn't all about social. But a good example of it was the police scanner traffic during around the bombings, where a lot of people were just essentially live tweeting what the police were saying to one another over the scanners. And the thing that comes to mind for me is that we need to remember, and I'm talking about journalists who are doing this. I think some people who do social most heavily in journalism they know a lot about social, but they need to learn more about journalism. And this was a real learning opportunity for them, because anybody who has covered cops and courts and these sorts of issues at least this is the way it is in America, and I don't know how it is in the rest of the world, but the police scanner conversations are filled with inaccuracies. The cops will tell you, oh yeah, most of what we're saying doesn't turn out to be true. We're having conversations about things we want to look into, but they were just being tweeted as if they were fact. And I think a lot of people learned lessons from that, and I heard from some people who specifically said, you know what, I wouldn't do that again, and I'm sorry that I did. And so I think that this has us talking again about the importance of setting some standards for how we use these networks, and making sure that we are, as news organizations, we're tweeting news. I mean, you can be tweeting other things too. I'm not saying that you have to be a machine, and we shouldn't just be broadcasting our stories, as Sue pointed out before. And you can have some conversations back and forth, asking for people's opinions and that sort of thing. But when we tweet something that says that something happened, we better be as confident about knowing that as we would have if we were publishing it on other platforms. So I think that's about as smart as we can get. The other piece of it, and I think we maybe get into this a little more broadly with everybody later if you want, but is the topic of being smart about knowing when not to use social media. But maybe we can leave that for a little bit, because I've been talking a lot.
Well, let's get into Boston. I was going to bring the conversation around to that eventually, but now it seems like a good time. And yeah, it seems like, as you were saying, a tremendous sort of case study just right in front of us about the pros and cons about how we use social media now and what that might tell us about how we should use it in the future. Sue Llewellyn, as sort of someone who thinks a lot, very deeply about sort of these issues. Can you, talk a little bit about how, as you were sort of watching the coverage of the Boston bombings, what was going through your mind? Like, how would you use this as a case study when you go around to teach people about what's good and what's not about social media for journalists?
I thought it was a fascinating case study in many, many ways. And I do think, whilst there were a lot of mistakes made, we've got a lot of lessons to learn from it. I think with the pendulum of the old media and new media, it's kind of swung back in favour of the old media and the ethics and the standards and the verification and all of those things. It was an amazing experience to watch how fast the news was moving. I personally thought it was appalling to be live tweeting the police scanner. And essentially, you can do that sitting in your pajamas in your bedroom. That doesn't really make you a journalist. There's this flood of noise and news that happens in a situation like that. And again, that's a human thing that people all want to contribute. They want to have their say. They want to be heard. They want to help, which was part of the thing with the Reddit community, wanting to help try and identify the bad guys. And that is a completely understandable human emotion. The fact is that it's very easy to get carried away in this kind of situation. And I personally think in social media, you have the right to remain silent because everything you say can be taken down and used in evidence against you. And actually, you are often right to be silent, not just have the right, but you are right to be silent and to verify before you start tweeting stuff, because everything you put out there is public and permanent. Even if you try and delete the tweet, which I think is a really bad idea, everything you say there is a sort of record. So if you want to say something on a story, first ask yourself, is it true? Who, what, why, when, where, how? Can I prove that this is true? And actually, will it add any benefit to the story or to myself as a journalist? Is it going to make me look good, or is it going to make my organization look good? And if not, shut up. Just take a breath and get away from the screen for a bit and start thinking a bit more instead of just going, I must say something about this, because that's a really bad mistake.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I think this is again, we were talking about the input and the output. What I did, for the most part, the day of the Boston bombings, I tweeted maybe once or twice that entire day. I spent my entire day looking at what was coming in. I would spend the entire day focused on news gathering, and so I think where there were a lot of missteps on the output end, I think there were a lot of great successes on the input side. I think, one thing we were doing at AP, and I'm sure others were doing similar things, is there are a lot of tools that have popped up recently that allow us to do things like find out exactly what social content was being shared in those last few minutes right before the bombs went off, within those few blocks where they went off. I mean, that gives you all kinds of fodder to work with for your journalism. Now, you have to be careful how to use that stuff. We're not just going to copy and paste it onto the wire, but most importantly, it gives us people to talk to. It gives us amazing sources who were there and who witnessed it, and in some cases might even have a picture they could share with us or a piece of video. I find that a lot of times, and I think this is not a bad idea, a lot of times when big dramatic news is breaking, the best thing to do is to focus on on news gathering and maybe not worry about tweeting so much. Most of my tweets that day, frankly, were just links to our stories after they had moved, because I just felt like I wanted to sort of share those with the world, and it was important for people to know where AP stood on various things. And I'm talking about from my personal Twitter account. I mean, the AP Twitter account was very, very active that day, and was essentially, was basically focused on tweeting links to content and offering quick updates of the things that we had confirmed and that were on the wire, because people wanted that. But as an individual journalist, my focus that day was on using these tools in the best ways I knew how to try to gather information. But a lot of time, but at the same time, just as sometimes you need to just shut up and stop tweeting, you also, when you're being a reporter and gathering information, you need to sometimes step away from the social networks too. I think two of the fallacies I come across from journalists about using social media are, number one, that you should use social networks for your reporting in every circumstance, and number two, you should never use social networks until everything else fails. Those are both wrong. You should use, whether or not you should use social media for your news reporting is like saying when you should use the telephone. You use it when it's the best tool for the job. If it's the way that you're going to get witnesses to an event because you know that they were there because of what you know from their social metadata, then sure, use it. But then you need to pick up the phone once you get contact information and you need to talk to them. If you can, and we did this sometimes too, if you have a reporter nearby, you can send them there and talk to them in person. And sometimes you just need to forget about Facebook and Twitter and everything else, and just get out of your pajamas and put on your shoes and go outside and do some reporting. It's about important decision making. The way I look at it, if social networks didn't have a use for journalism, I probably wouldn't be using them. And so my focus and our focus at AP, and I think probably a lot of us at this table, is just finding the best ways to use it to do our fundamental job.
Yeah. I would just say that "shut up and stop tweeting" would be another T-shirt I would buy. Massimo and Mark, The Economist is not a breaking news publication, and Italy is very far away from Boston. But nevertheless, I would love to hear both of your sort of input on the lessons of social media from the Boston situation, or anything you would have to say about what Sue and Eric were just talking about. Let's start with Massimo.
Io vi dico una cosa che è successa in Italia. Qui in Italia era sera e quando ci sono stati gli attentati, tutti quelli che erano su Twitter o comunque davanti a un computer hanno seguito le immagini, gli aggiornamenti, la questione che riguardava gli scanner della polizia, il fatto che quanti ritwittavano il fatto che non si dovesse dare questo tipo di informazioni. In Italia è successa una cosa secondo me interessante. Noi siamo stati negli ultimi 2 anni, parlo dei principali siti web informativi che sono i siti web dei grandi quotidiani italiani, siamo stati un po' ammalati di velocità. Noi abbiamo preferito, lo facciamo tuttora, però in occasione degli attentati di Boston c'è stata una differenza. In Italia dai tempi dell'omicidio di Osama Bin Laden, ma anche prima, c'era questa tendenza a dare qualunque notizia che uscisse sui social media, quindi foto improbabili del cadavere di Saddam Hussein o di Osama Bin Laden, senza alcun tipo di elaborazione intellettuale, giornalistica, tranne poi dopo 5 minuti o 10 minuti, una volta che si è ottenuto l'ascolto e quindi le pagine viste relative a quel tipo di notizia che tutto sommato è sbagliata, cambiandola, dicendo non è più così, in realtà era una immagine falsa. In occasione degli attentati di Boston, forse per la prima volta è successo il contrario, nel senso che per esempio negli Stati Uniti il New York Post scriveva notizie completamente lontane dalla realtà, molto sensazionalistiche sul numero di morti Ecco, una volta forse in Italia i grandi siti web avrebbero ripreso quella informazione prima di tutte le altre più cautelative, e invece non è successo. Forse c'è una lezione che abbiamo imparato proprio utilizzando i social media, che riguarda il fatto che la velocità non è sempre un bene, specialmente nel momento in cui si vuole differenziare un lavoro giornalistico da quello che invece sono i rumors che girano sui social media. Ecco, in questo caso vale un po' per tutti i siti informativi. In Italia c'è stata un'uniformità con quello che scrivevano CNN o New York Times, e questo secondo me è stata una buona notizia.
So it's events like Boston that make me pleased that The Economist is not a breaking news organisation, because it was very, very difficult to do well as an organisation. Breaking news generally, it's difficult to get it right. The scoop that you get from getting it right lasts about 15 seconds in social media, and you're competing against lots of other people. And I think The Economist to some extent is an antidote to that. You didn't, as an interested individual, you didn't need to know minute by minute precisely what was happening in Boston. What's really valuable to you is a sort of summary 24 hours later that really puts it into perspective, tells you what it means, suggests what might happen next. I think that's actually more valuable to you as a consumer. It might not be what you think you want to know, but it's probably what you'll be prepared to pay for. And I think social media is just going to push more and more of these organizations back into analysis and away from breaking news. And that's probably going to be quite difficult for the newswires, whose whole business model has been based on being first with the news. But for us, I think social media actually makes what we do more and more valuable, and it's one of the reasons why we're continuing to be successful. On the actual nuts and bolts of what happened in Boston, I don't know, I'm still making my mind up. I have very mixed feelings about what happened, especially with the Reddit, let's work out who did this, let's crowdsource a solution kind of idea. I mean, the first thing to say about that is that whether it's good or bad doesn't matter that much, because it happened and it's going to keep happening and you can't really stop it. So it's more about how we deal with it. On the second thing, the Redditors and the Twitterers, to a great extent, were doing precisely what the police had asked them to do. You know, the police want people to go through this information, this data. They want them to make connections. And if, let's say, the Redditors had got even close to the solution, which I don't think was impossible, we'd all be writing very different stories today, and we'd be having a very different conversation, and one day they will get it right. But what it really made me think was that maybe the police need to be asking different questions. You know, I hope at police conferences there are panels like this, where everybody says, what does citizen journalism, what does social media mean for policing? You know, and I hope they're thinking about building solutions where people can go if they want to help. You know, I hope that there are community managers in the police departments who are helping to guide these crowds, asking them the right questions and really making use of them, because I think this could be an extremely important development in policing, and I think there are many articles to be written about that. And just one final thing on this idea that sometimes you need to know when to shut up. One thing that we've not discussed yet is social media and the law, which is an increasingly interesting and developing world, and especially in Britain, where we have all sorts of tough libel laws and other laws, contempt of court, defamation, all of that. And I think there's been a sense up to now, Eric was saying that many people view social media, many journalists view social media as a softer platform, and I think we've all felt that regards to the law, it was a softer platform. And now we're finding out more and more that you can very much be taken to court for things that you say. We had this case in Britain not long ago where many Twitterers, many tweeters, not many news organizations, but many individuals, sometimes very high-profile individuals, tweeted the name of a senior politician in connection with a child abuse case, and he was entirely exonerated. He was not involved, and he took action against many of those who had tweeted his name, and there were some very large settlements made just because of these tweets, and some of them were just retweets. So this is going to keep developing. We don't really know precisely where it's going to go, but it's important to remember that the laws that apply to written content in magazines increasingly apply in just the same way on social media too.
On that concept of social media as a sort of a softer platform, which I think is a really interesting thing. And I'm going to throw this open to questions in a little bit, but before I do, I'm wondering, I'm going to start with Mark, and if anyone else has thoughts, please weigh in. Is the sort of idea of treating social media as a softer platform, is that necessarily detrimental to a news organization's brand? By which I mean, are sorts of mistakes or sort of looser information that goes across one's Facebook or Twitter accounts or whatnot, does that end up, or can that end up affecting the trust that readers have in, say, The Economist or the Associated Press as a whole? Or are people able to sort of compartmentalize and to say, okay, well, we understand that social media is more sort of conversational and a little bit quicker, and we might perhaps be a bit more accepting of things not always being right here, as long as this doesn't work its way over to the main product. Thoughts?
No, I think it's very damaging to your brand if you're making mistakes on social media. I think the only thing that news organizations have going for them, especially if they're into breaking news, when there's so much competition, I think being correct is absolutely fundamental and much less important than being timely.
I absolutely agree with that. I think for a lot of the AP is a great example of this, but for a lot of news organizations, if you have an inaccuracy that goes out as a tweet, say, that may actually be seen by more people than any other way you might distribute it. Our content, I mean, we're wholesalers essentially, so we're sharing content with other news organizations, newspapers and broadcasters and news sites, and then they share it with the world. If we tweet something, it goes directly to 2 million people, who then share it with whoever they decide to share it with, instantaneously. And yeah, it can be very damaging. And it brings up a lot of the legal issues that Mark was talking about before. I mean, that's another reason to essentially treat it the same way as our other platforms, because our journalists have a good sense of how to produce content that will stand up to legal precedent. And if we stick with that on social, then it should be reasonably safe as well. And there have been, I mean, I'm not going to get too specific, but there certainly have been lawsuits in the States based on tweets from news organizations or from their individual journalists, and it could be a big problem. The other thing is, I mean, there are a lot of aspects to the legal piece of this, which there are a lot of issues related to intellectual property as well with social media. There are a lot of concerns, for example, that using something like Pinterest to share photos from somebody's website, those sorts of things may result in lawsuits down the line. And we worry about it from the other end, about having our content shared in a way that we can't control it. We worry about that on a lot of social networks because, for example, the photos that we put out are incredibly valuable to us and a huge, huge part of our business. And it's important for us to be able to control sort of how they get used. And frankly, to be able to make revenue off of them, because gathering news around the world is an expensive business, and we need to be able to pay the bills. And so that's an issue too. So, which all comes back to the same concept. The content that goes out over social needs to pass muster in terms of accuracy. Maybe there are different ways you word it. Maybe there are different things you do in order to fit it into space. But the actual content, in terms of what you're communicating, needs to be something that would qualify for distribution on other platforms, I think.
Yeah, Sue, please.
I was just going to say I agree with everything about the damaging your brand if you get it wrong. But I'd also say that on the upside, it also, picking up a point that Massimo made earlier, it kind of reveals the workings of your journalism and the behind the scenes of what you're doing, so you can show how you came to conclude a particular sort of story that you did. So I think it makes it more accessible, and I don't believe that a certain amount of human activity makes you less authoritative. I think it just shows that you really do care about a story. And, you're kind of living it. Maybe you're in Syria doing something awful, saying something awful. If you followed somebody's tweets, you get a sense of that person, that you really trust what they say, that they feel it. And I think, so there is an upside to it, but I personally also think that as broadcasters or journalists generally, we have a duty of care, not just on the safety side, but on the ethics and the standards side. So we should be telling people, what you can and can't say. The legal issues are an absolute minefield, and copyright is a minefield. So we should be telling people what they can and can't do in the social space, which again will be building the trust.
Yeah, real quick, sure.
Yeah, so that's a very good point about the people in the field, and I don't want to suggest that all we want people doing is tweeting the facts that have shown up on the wire, because when we have people who are say in a place like Syria or in an interesting whether it's a conflict zone or a place in the world where news is happening, we do encourage them to tweet what they're seeing around them, and to sort of not only that, but even share sort of what it's like to be there, because part of what makes social work is being a human being. And I think this is especially important for individual journalists' accounts, and it doesn't necessarily matter as much for institutional accounts. It's a little more variable. The official AP account is actually mostly just about sharing content. The best way to really get the human side of it is to follow our individual journalists. So what we do is we point people there from our main account, so they can follow them in that situation. Another thing this brings up on the topic of maintaining the same accuracy on social as elsewhere is the issue of corrections, which we haven't talked about yet. And it's very important, especially on social, to be very transparent about what you got wrong. Now, we should be doing this on all of our platforms anyway. There's a little bit of a history in journalism about very loudly declaring the news and then very quietly the next day saying, oh, it wasn't quite right. And I think that we never should have been doing that in the first place, frankly, and we certainly can't get away with it now in social. So that means, if there's a tweet that has incorrect information, which is going to happen because even if you are following the same standards, sometimes what you report on all of your platforms could include errors. Then you need to follow it up with something else that goes on that same platform that says that you got it wrong and that offers the correct information. And I agree with what Sue was alluding to before, that it is not generally a good practice to delete the incorrect tweets. I think it makes more sense to leave that sort of trail, and people can see what you said and then what you said after that. For the most part, tweets live in the moment, and so that's sort of the point of it. The only time that we would recommend deleting a tweet in our circumstances is if there is some reason to do it related to legal issues. If there was somebody honestly, we haven't come across that circumstance yet, I don't think, the whole time I've been doing this at AP, but I'm waiting for the lawyers to tell me when that comes up.
I've got one last question before I open it up to you, and this is from Massimo. On the sort of point that you first brought up and that the rest of us have subsequently discussed about social media as a way to understand the human side of sort of people who you may have only known through their byline or their public profile. I think that's very true, but as you've also written before, that in a lot of places, in corporations, government, and perhaps some news organizations, there's one specific person who has been sort of designated as the social media guy, right? The person who is charged with responding to or interacting with individuals and readers. And I was wondering if you could talk about that sort of concept a little bit, about how sometimes about the way that how corporations or news organizations might say, yes, we want to be social, but don't actually follow through on that idea.
Sì, no, questo è un aspetto interessante. C'è una questione anche proprio di comprensione del metodo, nel senso che per esempio in Italia capita molto spesso che mi viene in mente un esempio tipico che secondo me è un errore, ma che insomma per carità è una scelta come un'altra. Quando il capo del principale partito italiano, che si chiamava Pierluigi Bersani, andava in televisione, mentre lui era in diretta in televisione, la stessa persona su Twitter spiegava delle cose. Allora questo era l'evidenza del fatto, questo prima ancora che loro cominciassero a mettere una sigla che riguardava il fatto che c'era lo staff che si occupava di questa cosa. E esiste sempre questa possibilità di difficile comprensione su dove dove arriva l'aspetto umano e dove invece c'è una speculazione su questa umanità, no? Quindi sul fatto che sia possibile gestirla da un punto di vista della comunicazione. Credo che con la frequentazione di questi strumenti poi ognuno di noi sia in grado, perché proprio lo strumento ce lo consente, di fare una selezione. Noi cominciamo a capire chi è veramente presente dietro lo strumento e chi invece lo utilizza per fini propagandistici o di marketing o aziendali. Credo che questa sia una cosa che non sia così complicata da scoprire. Certamente ci sono alcuni che lavorano in questo senso in maniera molto professionale, per cui molti utenti possono essere convinti del fatto che Pierluigi Bersani, mentre a che tempo che fa, di nascosto sotto twitta decine di tweet. Però evidentemente nella norma lo strumento stesso ci consente di avere un'idea abbastanza precisa del fatto che dietro c'è una persona. Lo dice il fatto, per esempio, che sia i giornalisti, ma vale anche per i politici, c'è una grandissima differenza fra chi usa Twitter in maniera come dire, molto schematica e molto simile all'utilizzo che si potrebbe fare di un altro strumento, di quelli che utilizzano gli uffici stampa, invece chi lo usa in maniera individuale. Ci sono alcuni politici, non tanti in Italia, e molti giornalisti che hanno una passione per questo strumento, e questa passione in qualche maniera poi raggiunge tutte le altre persone.
Mark Johnson, very briefly, if you would, before I open this up, the Economist has long been known for its authoritative institutional voice. Can you talk briefly about how you and your colleagues have come to make it such that you can discern the sort of individuals behind that voice, or if that isn't something that you guys care that much about?
I don't think we have made it possible to discern the individuals behind the voice. Certainly on our main brand institutional account, as much as possible, we try to quote from the actual text that we've written. As I said, on the smaller sub-accounts, we give people more freedom, but they're generally happy to write in the style of the paper, and I think that's really, it's our calling card. The Britishisms and all of it, I think, is what makes us instantly recognisable. And instantly recognisable is what you have to be on social media, or you're just going to fade into the noise.
Yep. As we were saying, and as we've been saying this entire week, the sort of key, it seems, to doing good journalism when all the odds are against you is figuring out what makes you different, and then trying to just follow that and follow your competitive advantage that way. Fascinating stuff. I've got a dozen more questions I could ask, but I will refrain, and I will open it up to the crowd. If you have anything for the panel, please raise your hand, and someone with a microphone should be around. We've got one up here, and a couple up here, actually.
Hi guys, sorry I arrived a little late, so you might have already talked about this, but I'm really interested if you guys could share some of the tools that are helping you amplify your social presence, because we've been talking about tweeting from a human sense, but I know that there is a lot of software out there that helps to distribute these tweets in a much more efficient way. So if you could just share the names of some of the tools and maybe how they've helped, I think we would all find that really useful.
Well, let's go down the line. Mark Johnson.
So our main tool for Twitter is Social Flow, which we've been using for a couple of years. We were one of their first testers. It does two things for us that are helpful. First of all, it's a very good way of managing all the content. So every time that we publish an article on our site, a tweet is automatically created for us within Social Flow, but it is held there. So we have many RSS feeds flowing in there. The tweets are held in there, and then when our social media editors have a chance, they log in, they edit the tweets, they make them much better, they make them more readable, and they just hit the push button to post it on out. And the second thing that it does is it has an algorithm that decides what order your content should be posted out in and at what time. So it looks at what the content is of your tweets, it looks at what the your followers are talking about and what topics are of interest to them, and it posts them out of its own accord. And it's a bit of a sealed box. It's hard to be sure exactly what it's doing, but we've run tests, so we've switched the algorithm off, and certainly our click-through rates and other metrics have gone down. The one problem with that kind of thing is that you need to be very careful when you're automating processes like that it doesn't tweet things out of context, so that you make sure that stories that are no longer relevant or have a short shelf life disappear. The other problem is that certainly in its early iterations, the algorithms and other ones that do that can be slightly dumb, and sometimes they will tweet out the very worst thing at the very worst time. So we had an example with the Japanese earthquake, where we had a story in our queue about some less than admirable part of Japanese culture, and it went out immediately when it saw everybody was tweeting about Japan. So that's the sort of cost of doing it that way. As for things like Facebook, I don't think we're using a tool for Facebook, partly because we noticed that EdgeRank is doing strange things. This is the algorithm that decides how many people actually see the content that you post on Facebook. And we had a sense for a while that if we used an external tool, we were actually getting less pickup than if we posted straight through Facebook itself. So these are the kinds of things that you have to experiment with, because it's not as simple as it appears at first glance.
Anyone else? Sure.
Well, it's strange that I'm talking actually, because I'm just going to say social flow too, because that's what we use at AP. We use it somewhat similarly to what they do at The Economist. We also, we have feeds that flow in for our various accounts, and but we do edit them. You can actually. There's a plug and play option too, where you can just have feeds go into social flow and it turns them into tweets. Tweets in potentia is what I like to call them. Sort of like tweets that are ready to go, and then social flow just decides when they're ready to go and they just go out. We don't do anything quite that automated. Similarly, we will go in and we'll revise the tweets. We like to handcraft all of our tweets, as The Economist does. I know that there's some debate about that, but we find that it's been very good for engagement for us. And then the additional thing that we do is when you can also, when you decide to put out a tweet, you can actually say, I want it to go out sometime in the next 2 hours or 3 hours or half an hour. And the system will decide the best moment within that range based on its algorithm. We've had mixed success with it. It actually is probably least successful for our main account, the AP Twitter account, partly because it's a very high volume account. We tweet probably 70, 80 times a day, maybe more, which is more than you would normally want to tweet in a day, but it happens to work for our account because people are coming to AP for breaking news. And I think because of the rapid pace of that, Social Flow's algorithm often says, well, there's just really no good time for this tweet because you just tweeted. So we're working with them to try to revise that. But on all of our other accounts, it's a lot more successful. With lower volume accounts, it tends to do quite well. We use it for Facebook too, but it's interesting what you're saying about the potential impact on EdgeRank, Mark. I may have to look at that. Oh, the other thing, by the way, about social flow is that it also it spits out some pretty decent metrics that you can look at afterwards. So you can even in real time, you can see right away from the tweets that have gone out how many retweets you've got, how many clicks you've got, and we find ourselves having conversations in the newsroom about that and sort of sharing that information. It's not gonna really dramatically guide the way we decide to gather the news, but if we find that there's a particular story that's resonating really well, we may at least stop for a moment and think about whether there's another angle we can go at it.
I should add that other tools are available. Yes. This isn't a sales pitch.
We have time for one more question. Any more questions from the crowd? There's one right up here.
I'd like to jump back to what Massimo was saying before about the night of the Boston bombings, because I was on duty in Repubblica.it, which is probably one of the websites that Massimo was referring to, so I can tell the other side of the story, why we were so cautious. The breaking news came out on Twitter. I saw it a good 5 minutes before it came on the news wires, and that's what it is now. Breaking news come on Twitter. But then there's also this new unwritten law that Twitter gives its best in the first 10 minutes after the breaking news, and it's worse in the following 45 or so minutes. So I gave what was coming out on the social networks at the beginning, and then I started to slow down. And one thing that was really helpful in the aftermath was curated lists on Twitter that came out from social media editors from big networks, and I gave that to our reporters that were covering the story in order to reduce the buzz that was on Twitter. And following, of course, the big media, not the New York Post. But that was a lesson that we learned from previous breaking news that happened, and mainly the Newtown massacre, Sandy Hook. And that was another very tough night. Being a mother was a very difficult news to cover. And, but the terrifying thing that was to realize the big media had trouble in US to cover it. So for us was a huge shock to understand that our safety net, CNN, you know, our big myth were having trouble to get it right. And in a way it was good. It was a good lesson to learn that we have to be less lazy here and trying to find new sources, new way to verify news, you know, cross-verify. And I think it's, in a way, it's positive that there's no such a thing as CNN is always right. It's no longer true. So that's a little...
If ever it was true to begin with. Yes, I think it's a very valuable comment. Now, we are almost done here. Before we conclude, I would like to just go down the line here for my panelists. And very briefly, each of you, if there's some tip or bit of advice that you would like to give that we haven't gotten to yet, you know, please offer it as sort of concisely as possible. I'll start with Sue Llewellyn.
I would say if you want to get smart with social, get strategic and get skeptical as well. Don't believe everything you read because there's an awful lot of rubbish out there. So definitely be strategic, decide what you want to get from this and how you're going to run the accounts and what your voice is and all of those kind of things. And then I'd also say my final tip, the 3 golden rules of social media is verify, 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 and that's it. So keep it going.
Yeah. I think I've hit most of it, but I mean, just to sort of reiterate the importance of just focusing on the journalism and remembering why we're using social. And I think it's important for a lot of the people who are really social savvy in the newsroom to spend a little bit more time listening to those people who've been in the newsroom for 30 or 40 years and doing this job for a long time, and to make sure that they really understand the basic principles of journalism and that they have really solid news judgment and that they know how to approach stories regardless of whether they're using social, because it'll be very important when they do use social in order to get things right and to do things safely and to take an ethical approach.
Massimo Mantellini.
Io dico solo una cosa che riguarda la velocità. Noi abbiamo oggi questi strumenti che sono nuovi, che abbiamo da 10 anni e forse anche meno, e abbiamo accesso a una quantità enorme di informazioni di tutti i tipi, e la velocità è la declinazione principale che ci raggiunge. Abbiamo necessità che ci sia una specie di barriera che divide quello che è la velocità delle informazioni che arrivano in rete da quelle che invece sono quelle che hanno una reputazione giornalistica. Questa barriera deve essere mantenuta il più salda possibile. Se il prezzo da pagare per questo è avere dei sistemi editoriali meno veloci, secondo me è un prezzo che vale la pena pagare.
Mark Johnson.
Stay true to your identity, resist dumbing down, and don't email anyone your password.
Wait, are you sure? I've made a huge mistake. Thank you very much. This was a fascinating discussion. There's a lot more to say, but I'm certain we'll have an opportunity to say it next year at a very similar panel. I'd like to thank my panelists for their insight and their input. From far left, Sue Llewellyn, a digital media consultant. Sue, if they want to learn more about your work, where can they go?
They can obviously go to Twitter. I'm at Sue Llewellyn, which is extremely difficult to spell, but just add lots of L's.
We'll figure it out. Eric Carvin, social media editor for the Associated Press. If they want to follow you or learn more about you, where can they go?
You should go with Twitter as well. It's just my name. It's at Eric Carvin, ERICCARVIN.
Massimo Mantellini, who writes for Punto Informatico, L'Espresso, and Il Post. Massimo, where can they follow you or read more of your writing?
Basta che cercate Mante su Twitter.
Perfect. And the always eloquent Mark Johnson from The Economist. Mark, if they want to learn more about what you're doing, where can they go?
Well, come to economist.com. Otherwise, follow me at MAJohns, MAJOHNS.
I am Justin Peters from the Columbia Journalism Review. Please join me tomorrow for the final of the 4 panels I've led here, in which we will discuss how to innovate in tough situations and how to overcome newsroom inertia to actually get something new accomplished. Thank you very much for your attendance. Have a great day.